I want to thank everybody for this morning's great, not only keynote, but a wonderful panel led by Captain Bonner. That was just awesome. So thank you for that. And this afternoon, we've got another great panel lined up. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel chair and moderator, someone who to this group probably needs no introduction, but I'll give him a brief one anyway. Captain David Moscoff. He is a professor at the United States Merchant Marine Academy, and he's also, to my great joy, has a unlimited master's license from the Coast Guard, and he has been involved in our efforts here for many, many years. He's an expert in maritime cybersecurity, and he's also a senior expert advisor to NATO's transport group for ocean shipping. So his bio is as impressive as it sounds, and he's got a really wonderful, wonderful panel, which I will let him introduce. But it's my pleasure to introduce Captain David Moscoff. Captain, over to you.
So we're going to ask Siri to go ahead and run our pre-recorded presentations, and I have a small brief intro to the panel. And we did make an abstract. I don't know if it's on line at this time, but we had a panel abstract, and hopefully their bios are readable to you, so I encourage you to read those. So we're going to go ahead and ask Siri to run that series of recordings.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and what remarkably fine seafaring weather we're having here today in the great state of Illinois, at least in virtual reality as we near the end of October. Honored guests, participants, producers, and our hosts, the Critical Infrastructure Resilience Institute of the University of Illinois, in collaboration with the National Academy of Sciences, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Captain David Moscoff. I'm honored to be here today as moderator for our Maritime Resilience and the Human Element panel, with our distinguished expert panelist, Captain James Scally, who is the manager, Maritime Assurance Americas from Shell Trading U.S. Company, Dr. Michael Benjamin, a principal research scientist at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, and Mr. John Jorgensen, chief scientist of cybersecurity and software at ABS, the American Bureau of Shipping. You may know that as far back as the 1500s and earlier, the history of maritime resilience and the human element shows that mariners have faced human element and maritime resiliency challenges in significant and varied ways, whether from using new navigational aids and improved ship designs to coastal and inland route sailing, to navigating on open seas with uncertain charts, wayward icebergs, dense fog, and luckily at times, clear starry nights. The relationship between humans and the maritime environment is without question inspiringly steadfast. Today, this 2020 Maritime Resilience and the Human Element panel inspires us as we ask and answer questions on dealing with various aspects of human resilience in the 21st century maritime environment. From Shell's Captain James Scally acclaimed report on the unique, successful program linking human resilience and safe maritime operations modules, and his accompanying video, to MIT's Dr. Michael Benjamin's scientific research and work in the global use regarding autonomous marine platforms in academia, industry, and defense, to ABS's Mr. John Jorgensen's scientific brief concentrating on active risk management techniques based on a best practice and interface with the human segment of cybersecurity, we are most fortunate to have before us this truly expert panel to make their presentations today. Please read through the MRS online material for these distinguished speakers' bios. Also, opinions I might express here as moderator are my own. Moving on to our presentations, we will begin with Shell's Captain James Scally. Our second panelist is MIT's Dr. Michael Benjamin, and we will conclude the panel's presentations with a briefing by ABS's Mr. John Jorgensen. And again, you're encouraged to read their impressive bios. What will we hear and see from this distinguished panel is that human resilience has almost always been the key between success and failure of maritime enterprises. Following our panel's three expert presentations, we look forward to your Q&A participation as we interact with you live, answering your insightful questions and having active discussion. Thank you all.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Scally. I'm the manager of maritime assurance for the Americas. As Dave, thank you for inviting us to participate in this venue. It was a great event last year and looking forward to this year. I start out with our cautionary note from our legal department. If you can't read small print, basically it means don't make any investment decisions basis what I tell you today. And since I'm just talking about safety stuff, I doubt that you would anyway. So. And I'll proceed into what I want to talk about today. I'm going to talk about an overview of Shell Shipping and Maritime. Going to talk about our Maritime Partners and Safety Program, and then I'll get into different things around resilience. So, Shell Trading and Supply is where Shipping and Maritime resides, and we have approximately 7,000 employees worldwide. If you include both tankers, tugs, barges, offshore supply vessels, and anything that moves on the water, Shell has an interest in about 2,000 vessels at any given time that are on the water all over the world. We also actively manage, and I say manage, that means technically operate, where there's Shell personnel on board and operated out of our office in London, 50 vessels, and the overwhelming majority of those are LNG tankers. So back in 2011, Dr. Graham Henderson took over as our vice president, and we took our first look in totality of the incidents and things we were having across the globe. And as I said, that covers upstream, downstream, mobile offshore drilling units, many, many different types of vessels. And in that 2,000 vessels, we were having a incident every 7 days, every 7 calendar days. And now I say have an incident. That means it's either an actual incident or a potential that one could have happened. So that was very significant for us, and a kind of an eye-opening thing for us when we looked at it holistically across the globe, where we hadn't really done that in the past. And we knew something had to be done. So what we first thing they came up with was this Maritime Partners and Safety, and we brought in the CEO from all different companies across the globe that we engage with. Over the next 4 or 5 years, the different pillars of this house you see here were developed. The first being good quality leadership visits by the CEOs of the vessels, going on board and engaging with their crews and making sure that they do that periodically to make that connection. The next was reflective learnings, and these were focused on things where we had seen trending in incidents. And every 6 months, Shell would release one of these, and it was a full sit-down thing that would go on with a video that would have points where you would stop and you would engage the crew for their discussions and to bring them into the topic. Because what we found is that if you just read something to people, that it's very limited retention. But when you talk about it, that's a big difference. So that's where that came about. And then the last one was added was learning from incidents, these were meant to replace like the LFIs, which would be placed on bulletin boards and just hey, be careful, watch out for this. So what we did with these there's kind of like the reflective learning I just described, but more like a flip board, and it would be a small group of people would talk through smaller, more relevant items to people on different kinds of ships. And those come out more frequently. And that worked well. And over the next 5 years, we saw a threefold improvement. And we got to about 25, one injury in every 25, or one incident in every 25 days. And that was good, but we kind of stayed plateaued for a little bit. And we had trouble that we maintained it, but we couldn't push through to the next barrier. So we went looking for other things. We reached out to our friends at Shell Health and got talking about resilience. And we brought that in and added that as the foundation that you see here below in our process. So when you look at resilience, what does that mean? So resilience is the ability to cope with pressure and be able to bounce back from that. And that was one of the things that when we first started this, for many of us, including myself, I heard resilience, and I really didn't know what that meant, right? So it took a while for it to sink in. Well, now think of us translating that to English as a second language people, or translating it into multiple languages for the multiple crews we work with around the world. So that was a challenge. Many of our operators use the term bounce back, was why they kind of changed it to, and they took into theirs. All the other things I mentioned, they were very kind of physical type changes or things we could fix, where this is much more of a culture change. And, to be honest, it was one of the more difficult things that we've encountered through this program. So now I'd like to show you a little video just describing resilience, and we'll start that now.
Our people work in hazardous environments, and it is the responsibility of all of us to keep ourselves, our teams, our assets, and the environment safe. Following safety practices and processes help us achieve this. Building our resilience also strengthens our ability to stay safe. Resilience is the ability to bounce back after a stressful situation. It's about being able to effectively deal with problems and using different tools and techniques to overcome them. But what does practicing resilience techniques have to do with safety? Challenging or frustrating situations can cause stress and our brain and body to react. When there is too much stress, our brain converts the stress signals it receives into an alarm, which activates our flight or fight response. Fight or flight is our body's way of getting us out of dangerous situations. Our body produces hormones which prepare the body to act fast, but this takes energy away from the thinking part of our brain. This response developed in humans 300,000 years ago to help us to react quickly and protect us against life-threatening danger, such as saber-toothed tigers. Today we do not need to deal with saber-toothed tigers, but our brain and body still reacts to too much stress in the same way. Developing resilience gives us the skills to better control our fight or flight response, essentially training our brain to see stress in a different way, freeing up our brain to utilize our skills and experience to the best of our abilities during stressful situations and while working in safety-critical environments. The good news is that resilience is a skill that can be learned, and like any skill, the more you practice, the better you become. The importance of developing resilience skills has been known for many years and is practiced widely among professional athletes. They spend hours training and maintaining their fitness, but they also spend time on their mental game. Athletes and sports teams build their resilience skills to ensure they can think quickly and remain focused against the most challenging opponents. Those who are resilient move through the stress and frustration of defeat quickly. Of course, for athletes, the worst thing that can happen is that they lose the game. The stakes are higher for us. When things go wrong at work, we can lose lives. So it's even more important that we build our resilience and ability to remain focused, even in the most stressful situations. This is true for us as individuals and as a team. We can start with the Resilience Program, which is team-based, made up of a series of modules which focus on specific resilience techniques. The program lets participants learn together, strengthening and supporting each other. Resilience techniques are practiced using scenarios, and the participants share insights on how to apply resilience to their lives and to safety-critical situations. Working proactively on resilience as a team, we benefit from others' interpretation, seeing how they may approach similar scenarios in ways we have not thought about ourselves, thereby keeping ourselves, our teams, our assets, and the environment safe.
Great. I hope that helped a little better than I can to translate stuff. But it's been a long road, and like I said, it's a tough concept to kind of understand it. And it was based a lot on science and the way the human brain works, as was mentioned below, and how we react. We're all born with a certain level of resilience, but it's something definitely you can improve on. And that improving has to do a lot with, the unknown quantity in safety is human behavior. And, when you look back at whatever incidents happen, the overwhelming majority is human behavior. So that's why we wanted to focus on resilience. So from that, we developed modules and engaged with Shell Health and the scientists that they work with. We came up with a system where we created simple modules, take about 30 minutes to complete, And they're meant to engage people, and they can fit into companies' existing safety programs, not just something that's pushed down from us, say you must do this. And the biggest thing for us is that it doesn't take an expert to teach it. It's very simple and can be done by anybody. They're all provided, and this information is available on a website that I'll provide at the end, is on a facilitator and a participant guide for each module. And on these are all developed, and they take you through them step by step. And the first one we started out with was Introduction to Resilience. So as we go through that, you learn what that meant, and then you could go on from there. And they're very simple, but they make you think, and that's what the whole idea was, and it's supposed to make it work that way. So we found that the fundamental success of this is having somebody within the company that we're working with that is a champion for this and has it. And then you could have support facilitators that do it. But once you've gone through it, basically anybody could teach it. And it's been one of those things that's been a real improvement over time. Is most things we do, you need a formal leader to do it. This, because it's more interpersonal, you really don't need that. And the modules can be used as guidance for that. So now there's 15 modules available on the site. Shell has something like 40 across the company, but we specifically made or challenged these towards being for maritime use. The other is, it used to be called Resilience only on there. Now when you look it up, it'll say Care for People, because we've increased that. And over the last few years around the world, with all the things going on in the globe, there's also been an increase for focus on mental health. And we've kind of wrapped it into a section called Care for People. So we broadened it. So there's 15 modules there. If you're interested, you're more than welcome to go look or use them how you see fit. At the end of 2019, last year, we were successful in reaching one incident in every 43 days. So that's up from one in every 7 days. And that's been great. And I'm proud to say that we're also in 2020, the trend is showing continued improvement. And hopefully that will continue the same. And just in closing here, if you have any further interest, you can see from the website here, this is where it's located, and be under Care for People. If you don't remember that, you can always search Maritime Partners and Safety and go to the Shell site for that. And while I have the opportunity, I figured I'd also throw out that there's a Shell developed with a consortium of other industry players, an app that's available in the App Store and Google Play Store. It's not just about resilience, or it's more around that care for people, and especially in today's COVID actions and having to do different things and people being stuck on board ships for long periods of time. One of the things we put out is this Maritime Wellbeing app, and it gives you some good tools to work with people, and they may be helpful to you and the things that you do. But thank you for your time, and it's been nice sharing with you today, and I look forward to questions.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Benjamin. I'm with MIT's Department of Mechanical Engineering, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about some marine autonomy research at MIT. In particular, out of all the problems we want to discuss, we're going to talk about marine navigation, in particular Colregs navigation. So this is one of my favorite videos, pulled off the internet a couple years ago. I think it's the Port of Amsterdam. Obviously sped up. I hope it's a holiday. I hope that's not a regular day. But there's a lot of things going on in this picture. So clearly there's a lot of traffic. There are some general rules being followed. Vehicles are generally heading up the river on the right side, but there's a lot of improvisation as vehicles are cutting across, pulling into docks, things like that. So there are the rules of the road for open water and inland navigation called the Colregs, and we'll discuss a little bit about that, but I'm assuming a lot of people have already heard about that and know what they are. If you have heard of the Colregs, you'll know that they were written for humans. They're a documentation, a document that describes what to do in certain situations in terms of the protocol for collision avoidance. And there's a lot of things that when I say they're written for humans, there's a lot of things I mean by that. So humans use a lot of common sense, as they are in this video, because clearly there's a lot of other things going on besides just collision avoidance. Humans are really good at improvising too. So when things don't go quite as planned or as they're prescribed in the rules, they're really good at using that common sense and improvising and making the situation work. Humans are also really good at generalizing. So the Colregs rules were written for collision avoidance from the perspective of one vehicle at a time. And clearly humans are pretty good at being able to deal with multiple vehicles simultaneously. So there's a lot of things in there that if we want to bring call regs to autonomous vehicles, or if we want to bring call regs to decision aids for manned vessels, that we are going to have to be clever about how we encode those rules. So all of this leads to these rules, and human common sense and resilience and improvisation leads to a system that's quite resilient for humans, and we want to have that same resiliency in an autonomous system. Over on the right, we have a quick pointer to our open source marine autonomy software project and a web link. So we've been developing autonomy for marine robots for about a decade and a half, a little bit longer, depending on how you start the clock. And the secret sauce, or not so secret sauce, is a form of multi-objective optimization that we use. Our helm, which controls the vehicle, has a number of behaviors. Each one of those behaviors is focusing on something that the vehicle is trying to accomplish, such as getting from point A to point B, but also avoiding all these other contacts. So our helm reasons about situations with these behaviors, and we use the multi-objective optimization model and method to resolve those conflicts or multiple sources vying for control of the vehicle. And the output of that mathematical problem is a decision in the form of a heading and speed decision for that particular moment in time. And that problem is formulated and solved multiple times per second for each vehicle. So to dive into Colregs just a little bit, for those of you who haven't seen it before, here's a fun example with 5 vehicles on the left. And these vehicles all have different Colregs rules that they're dealing with, but they all deal with them fairly well and in adherence to the Colregs in that situation. And this is a common test environment that people have dreamed up for testing Colregs, is to have all these vehicles out on an outer circle, running to a point on the other side of the circle and seeing how much of this we can do and how fast we can do and where the system breaks. So Colregs are useful, but you can imagine there are situations in the middle here where this is a non-Colregs maneuver between these two middle vehicles, but they happen to be non-Colregs in the same sort of offsetting way. So in both cases, you have a case where we have a lack of collision avoidance, which is great, but I would say in the non-Colregs case there, we sort of got a little bit lucky in the sense that two vehicles did the wrong thing at the same time and they sort of offset each other. And over here on the right, we have a situation where we're not so lucky, where the two vehicles do the wrong thing, but they don't offset each other, and you have a dangerous situation. So we want to avoid that, and we want to have a Colregs rule set available for our autonomous vehicles so that as vehicles are approaching each other, without any communication between each other, just like any other protocol, the vehicles have an understanding of what their roles are and know what the right thing to do is. So let's see, going to the next page. So some of our testing at MIT is involving small vehicles on the water. So we're extremely lucky on campus to have in the bottom right and the bottom center there, rather, the MIT Sailing Pavilion, where we have our Marine Autonomy Research Lab. And we have several platforms that we use for testing. The bottom left is a Boston whaler that we've made autonomous over the last couple of years through a donation from Mercury Marine, who's donated this platform to us for autonomy development. And the bottom middle is a vehicle called the WAM-V, a Wave Adaptive Modular Vehicle. It's about a 15-foot long surface craft that allows us to have a vehicle that we can put our sensors and camera systems on and computer systems, et cetera. But in the bottom right are small surface craft made by ClearPath Robotics in Canada. these vehicles are less capable in the sense of being able to put a lot of equipment on them, but they're better for us in the sense that we can have 5 or 6 of them at the water at the same time, and they're also our teaching platform. And the upper right, we have a drone view of the Boston Whaler and the WAM-V doing collision avoidance with each other and doing a little bit of follow the leader exercise. And they're all using the same multi-objective optimization method that we've developed, which is sort of shown in the upper left, where we have an example situation between 2 vehicles that are looking to avoid each other. And that plot in the middle is a very typical plot output by our collision avoidance behaviors, where the red and blue values represent the utility of possible maneuvers between vehicles. And those plots are being generated and formed several times per second to feed into our optimization engine. And in this case, what we see here in this plot, the blue represents maneuvers by ownership in the middle that would result in a collision that we see with the contact. And red values are all clear maneuvers, vehicles that don't violate any constraints on closest point of approach between 2 vehicles. So we do a lot of our testing on the river, and we're lucky to do that. But as I mentioned before, we have this open source project that's been online for a number of years, and we released a version of the ColRegs rules in 2017. So now we have some users who are also using this on their vessels, and that's where things become fun. Some of the more larger vessels that our users have used are examples are Textron Unmanned Systems in Maryland, who have ported the collision avoidance code onto their Navy vessel. It's called the Common Unmanned Surface Vehicle. And the upper right is a vessel shown by Sea Machines, which is a company here in Boston that develops a vehicle autonomy for existing surface craft. And they have adopted our code and built a number of capabilities on top of that code to field commercial platforms. And in the bottom left is a snippet from a demonstration by Rolls-Royce and Finn Ferries in December 2018. And we joined with them to provide code in certain circumstances, in this case, the ColRegs collision avoidance circumstance that you see here, where that big vessel, which is under autonomous control, is doing a give-way maneuver with the vehicle that's crossing in front of it. And lastly, in the bottom right is shown a USV by Thales in the UK, and they use this platform for mine countermeasure missions. And they have adopted and extended our code over the last several years and have done some amazing things with that. These are users where they essentially take the open source code base, extend their own capabilities to meet their own needs for their own customers. But we do learn a lot from their use of it. It helps us understand what capabilities in the open source domain are of general use for people, and it helps us guide our research in terms of what we should be trying to make better. So looking forward, I would say beyond the basic simulation capability, which we're showing here, automating our simulation capability is extremely important. As you can imagine, the number of possible situations for the vehicles could encounter each other and would have to do collision avoidance is virtually unlimited in the number of combinations. So we have to automate our simulation, and we have to be sure that the software is robust across a wide variety of cases. In the bottom left here, we have a more or less open-ended scenario where the vehicles are doing collision avoidance with each other, but also doing obstacle avoidance through a field. And we're simulating LiDAR returns on those objects. And as the vehicles become aware of those objects, they spawn collision avoidance behaviors with the obstacles and also with each other. And in the bottom right is a set of simulations that we have automated on our computers to distribute across dozens and dozens of computers to run these scenarios over and over again. In this case, we're showing 8 different simulations of the same starting point. And although we typically randomize that starting point, we also see a lot of variation even for systems that start from the same starting positions, just through the non-deterministic nature of multiple processes running on a vehicle. And lastly, interoperability, we're quite aware that a lot of the systems that our users are using the software on, autonomy is only one system on the ship. And they might be plugging it in as the autonomy system, but there might be a navigation system from another vendor. There might be a sensor processing system from another vendor still. And then we have to learn how to develop our autonomy systems that are built to specs and learn how to play with other people's capabilities. And that about summarizes that. That's my last slide, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Good afternoon. I'm John Jorgensen. I'm the Chief Scientist for Cybersecurity and Software at American Bureau of Shipping. ABS is very much interested in reliability and dependability of systems because it affects the overall safety and the safety posture of the systems and of the ship. Cybersecurity is an important part of the reliability aspects of ships, so we're going to talk about reliability and resilience in the context of cybersecurity working for the mariners on board ships, offshore platforms, and in the marine world. In automation systems, shipboard, we have potential and risks. And risk is really dual-sided. It's the risk of something happening, but it's also the risk of something not happening. So the potential is on the positive side for things that we can do with automation systems for the good of mariners and of the operators and of the greater marine environment and the ecosystem. The risks include things that we can account for, however, and how we account for them is in looking at the life cycle of the requirements themselves and of the life cycle of the systems and the ships and of the mariners that we have on board as part of that cycle. The automation systems that we get connect to one another. We don't just install systems or integrate systems anymore. We also connect them. So they have interdependencies amongst them, and they have requirements associated with them such that we have now dependencies. And when we start putting things into place, we consider the potential and we consider the positive side, but we also have to think about things like what happens if. And the what happens if question comes out of the has-id, has-op world, and it looks at what could possibly happen in the event that one of these automation systems doesn't perform as expected or it fails. We think about vulnerabilities for systems, and we think about how they're going to work for them, all in the same breath. But what we have to be able to do is separate these things into the automation systems and how they can possibly be touched. Because how they can possibly be touched or contacted or connected with will determine what the overall reliability of the systems happens to be. I will invite you to think of something completely different for security. Security is really more than the protective functions that are put into place around a particular system. You have human processes that have to be part of that. And then you have to have predictability and performance, which means knowledge of those systems so that you understand exactly what they're going to do and when they're going to do it and how they're going to perform. That means that when you have correct knowledge, you can anticipate how they are going to perform, and you have expectations of what normal is as opposed to abnormal. System reliability depends entirely on the functional integrity of the system. If the system as installed and as operated is working according to plan and it is limited in outside connectivity such that it is doing what it's supposed to be doing and cannot be interrupted, then you have good system reliability and you have the expectations of the operator that will be met. Function in this case is also an asset that you have to take care of and you have to consider. You take care of it by looking at what the economic function or the mission function of a particular series of assets might be. And you may have 29 assets, that is automated systems, all in place to satisfy a set of requirements. The outcome of that set of requirements is a production line that's pushing out goods or it is a set of services that require certain interdependencies and inputs in order to provide an output. It can be the ship being propelled through the water satisfactorily. But the function is separate from the individual systems. And we consider that the function is intact if the mission is being accomplished and the systems are behaving as they're expected to do. This becomes a risk management milieu, however, and we have to consider what the factors are that provide our operational risk posture, insofar as, do we understand what's happening and how it's happening? Do we understand what the security posture of this particular system of systems happens to be? And how capable are our operators in not just operating these systems, but also watching them to make certain that they function as according to plan? Reliability and robustness go together intimately. Reliability is something that you can understand and you can measure in many cases, because it does have a definite linkage to probabilistic factors associated with the material condition of the systems. But the robustness gets to fault tolerance, and that leads directly to, do I understand what the risk posture of my systems are and whether they are going to function correctly or not? You have to think in terms on the left side of this particular slide, what's the mission or business purpose? And then consider, how are we monitoring the system functions so that we know that we're meeting our business or mission function? You have to look at what the systems are that are satisfying your requirement, and will they have potential impacts outside your domain, as opposed to simply saying the function is not operating. What happens if the function does not operate and that causes a safety issue? If it precipitates other impacts outside your fence line or outside a particular space or outside a networked system, you have to take those things into consideration to understand I'm monitoring it and I know what normal happens to be in this operational context. If you have fault tolerance in place, then that means that you can now start thinking in terms of how are we protecting from unauthorized access or connection or functions, and how are the systems maintained so that we maintain them in a way that gives us measurable reliability and robust resilience. And then how do I do casualty control? How do I put these things together and measure them and understand where they come from and how I can operate my systems? What I will tell you is that we've devised a method by which you can do active risk management. And we are pushing this active risk management every time we talk to people about cyber safety and cybersecurity. Effectively, an active risk management program is a cyber program that's put in place to accomplish what is necessary for the automation systems that are really effectively additional employees. You don't often think of an automation system as the equivalent of an employee or of a mariner. But in reality, if it has a CPU associated with it and it's executing software, it's something that needs to be supervised, just like a person. But it's not as sophisticated as a person, and it doesn't take instructions. It takes instructions very well and will do exactly what it's told, but it doesn't improvise well. And so that's why you have to be very careful about supervision of these so that you understand what measures must be put into place as those minimum requirements so that you've got reliability and robustness built in to give you resilience of systems. Your cyber risk management then becomes a management system that goes with your safety management system or any other management system so that you maintain corporate knowledge and so that you can proceed and build upon the foundation and do better and go faster than you would if you allowed people to simply operate with directions that hang on laminated tags next to the equipment. But they have to be trained. They have to understand what the goals and objectives for cybersecurity and for the resilience happen to be so that they understand what the functions are that they're helping to protect and what it is that they're looking for that is normal to help them do their jobs and protect themselves and the systems and the ship and the environment. Now, toward that end, your cybersecurity risk management system includes several characteristics and several subcategories, and those are listed up here on the right side of the slide. I'm not going to belabor those, but they all look familiar, don't they? But if you put them together in a risk management system so that you know what your assets are and you train people for those assets and you give them job descriptions that define what accesses they will have, and you tell them what your policies are for operating the systems and what safety is in this context and what happens if you have to respond to a failure of a particular system. You can also talk to them about where the locks and guards and gates go for the physical security, as well as the digital versions of locks and guards and gates for your protective functions that go on. And then you talk in terms of other factors as well to integrate these things together. But overall, an active risk management program becomes an active cyber program as part of your overall system of systems and its operations. I'm open to questions. I think that this is an important topic that we should discuss. Cybersecurity is important to those automated systems and software-intensive systems that we have to operate and work with. It's not the only set of considerations. We have many other things to consider as well. But we have to think about how we can load the deck in our favor so that we have reliability and resilience built in, and cybersecurity is part of that. Thank you.
Well, I have to say, I really want to thank our panelists for a very, very outstanding set of presentations, highly informative, certainly giving us a lot to think about. And we want to go right to the questions that I'm sure are piling up right now. So let me take a look at our chat, and I'm not seeing any boxes come up yet on the chat. Let's see if we have any hands up. And I don't see any hands yet. So I'm going to give about another 5 seconds and maybe pose one of my own questions. So, as you know, our ABS colleague at the end here talked about not doing too well as far as a computer being able to take instructions versus being able to improvise. So I'm hoping your people there can improvise enough questions for us here. We have a few minutes and we're looking for your improvised questions. So, see.
Captain Moskoff, there is a question. Andrew Tucci is asking about thoughts on stress testing, cybersecurity management systems, and integrating those tests with other non-cyber simulation events or exercises.
Okay, well, I see Andrew Tucci, but I don't see a hand next to him. So if any of you want to take that question, I don't have it to show you, but if anybody want Andrea to repeat it again? And Jack McCready has one as well. So let's take Captain Tucci's again. Any thoughts on stress testing cybersecurity management systems and integrating those tests with other non-cyber simulations, events, and exercises?
David, I'll take that one.
Okay.
The idea is that if you know what your system is, you can start to document it, and you can then train that so that people understand what normal is. When you go to interface your cyber systems with the non-cyber enabled systems, and that includes straight-stick automation systems as well, when you put all the pieces together, you should be able to come up with something that you can step through. Very much like with an operational technology system. You can step through it to say, okay, at time X, you have the following activities, you have the following things going on. And you can start to game what you're doing with the cyber systems and then start to look at what the fault modes of those happen to be. I'm very much in favor of understanding what your fault modes are and your failure modes, both in the context of conventional safety analysis like a HAZOP, but also in the context of the system engineering for a failure modes and effects analysis. And when you look at it in this way, you can start to integrate all the systems that you have on board and understand what the contributions and the potential risk factors are associated with the automated systems as well as with the non-automated systems. Non-automated systems, of course, include the human mariners on board, and you have to include the people as part of the system. Any system engineer you talk to is going to include the people as part of the system as the most critical part of that, whether operating or supervising. So that's how I would initially address that for Captain Tucci.
Okay, and I don't know, John, if you can see Jack McCready's comment. It's not a question, but if you want to address his comment, he says the new CMMC requirements will be one approach. He's volunteering there for Captain Tucci.
Yes, and I'm implementing CMMC as an approach for ABS right now, so I'm more than a little familiar with that. Yes, it's a very good way to approach the problem. But again, you need to have that way to step through the requirements so that you understand exactly how they fit, and then the people provide the bounce back and the resilience for that where necessary.
Okay, well, I'm gonna pull up this question here. It's the takeaways you'll have from each other here after today's events. For the past 11 years, we've been very, very proud of our networking sessions. We try to take numerous breaks at the MRS and let people chat and learn from each other and make good connections. And as far as networking being virtual this year, wanted to ask the three of you, maybe if you could all take a crack at this, to say what you've learned from each other. You've heard each other's presentations now at least twice. And starting with Captain Scally and then Dr. Benjamin, finishing with you, John, would you each brief us on what you've learned from each other today? And this way you'll all get to see Captain Jim live and Mike live as well. So here we go.
Great. Well, starting out there, I would say, looking at Dr. Benjamin's work, it was just amazing to me of being in situations like that, of multiple vessels and the coal regs being, written for people, but then trying to mimic them with computer software is amazing. And I never knew it'd be that difficult, but it's amazing all the outcomes that can come from that and the challenges behind that. So it's amazing to see the efforts that have gone into that to do things that people do every day and have collisions. So this helps out to keep those autonomous vehicles from having the same collisions and the same human decisions that maybe people make poor choices on sometimes. So that's how technical that is pretty amazing to me, and it's also pretty cool that we can actually test it in a test bed along with not just on a computer mock-up. As far as Mr. Jorgensen's work, it's amazing to me also that the way that this interacts with cybersecurity, because the thing with the cybersecurity is you always have humans that are trying to work around things in other ways. So it's always going to be a challenge there, and that how he works with the systems to come up with protective barriers and using the methodology that we use for different systems to have barriers and recovery measures to address these, because like anything, there will be gaps, or people will find ways around things, and the more ways we can set up barriers to prevent that, and then recovery measures to solve that is great. That we're thinking ahead of that rather than just playing catch up. I think that's pretty impressive. That's great.
That's great. So either Mike or John, you want to come in?
I guess I'll jump in. Hopefully you can all hear me. But yeah, so going back to Captain Scally's talk there, the light bulbs that started to go off while listening to him and his talk was the process of building resiliency skills. It is a process, and we're just starting to incorporate that into some of our research. Our typical research nowadays is we build algorithms. We might even build algorithms and robots to work with people, and we test it to see whether it has an impact. But very, very rarely do we really go down the path of recruiting test subjects to do what we call longitudinal studies, which is really trying to understand how these human-robot systems come to improve the lives of the humans over time, because it may not be that initially human-robot systems are as effective as they could be. And if we can study more longer term the effects of the human-robot interaction, then we can understand how humans train and learn to use robots. And if we can understand that process better, then we can actually build training systems that would quickly bring people to this sort of set point where they're using robotic systems most effectively. So it's good to think about building resiliency skills and think about it as a process and not something that's just going to happen immediately once you introduce robotic systems alongside human systems. And Mr. Jorgensen, I think it reminded me of risk management. We think of risk management as making sure our systems work. We don't have collisions or near misses, et cetera, but more and more of our users and the people who are interested in using this kind of technology are also interested in what are the risks in terms of hackability, cybersecurity, et cetera. Especially in a project, it's an open source project like ours, there's often a misconception that if it's open source, then people can inject changes to the code and have nefarious effects. Of course, that our open source project still does not just allow random users to inject code changes. There's a process for proposing code changes and accepting those changes. But nevertheless, the cybersecurity concerns are growing. And his talk was a good reminder that we need to keep our eye on that ball as well.
John, any thoughts?
I always have a few thoughts, and my thought here is interoperability and integration. Because when we integrate the talks from Dr. Benjamin and Captain Scally, what I get is looking at the resilience framework and the resilience toolkit and an application of it with the decomposition of functions, the decision-making functions, so that you can effectively combine a toolkit of moderation in the behaviors along with what the expectation for the behaviors will be. When you put that together, it brings to mind a very nice little video from Boston Dynamics from about 18 months ago. That the first time I thought I saw it, I was quite in wonder of it, because what it was a picture of their mule simulator, and there was a man in the lab who was trying to kick the mule simulator to knock it down. And when I saw the video the first time, I thought, he's being so cruel to this robot. Why is he doing this? But what it really came down to was, how do you install resilience as part of the overall process for cyber-enabled systems? You're really looking not just at logical functions that can possibly behave or misbehave. You're also looking at those things that are electromechanical or hydraulic that are providing you function for the rest of the system, and you have to accommodate those as part of your risk management system. So when Dr. Benjamin mentioned his change management there for the software, that's one of the aspects that has to be in place for a complete cyber management system. None of the aspects of a cyber management system really require much more than the conscious system engineering thought that you put into an integrated, interoperable system. But it requires the phasing and the ordering of these things to work for the person or the people who are operating it so that it works best for everybody.
That's great. That's good points. Mr. Lewandowski.
Yes, good afternoon, gentlemen.
Yes.
This one's for Dr. Benjamin. Just curious, what level of effort, either in the initial coding, the machine learning, or the resultant artificial intelligence development, did you put into addressing COLREG's Rule 2, the exoneration rule in special circumstances?
Yeah.
Almost all of the work that we put into in the COLREGs has to do with the common scenarios of give way, crossing, stand on, and head on, and overtaking. So we were just starting to look at other rules and other circumstances, and of course we have a generic handling of in extremis situations, which is just based on closest point of approach. So expanding out beyond what our current capabilities are is something that we're starting to look on with our current graduate students.
Thank you.
Okay, that was a great question, and just for anyone who doesn't know COLREGs too well, Rule 2 kicks in when you have a collision situation developed with 3 or more vessels versus the other common situations where you have 2 power-driven vessels, which Mike says is what they're working with. But Rule 2 is much, much more complex, so that was a great question.
Of course, we do regularly test multi-vehicle collision situations, but it's an extension of the other rules. We basically treat each one of those one-on-one encounters as if it was a single one-on-one encounter, and then generalize with the objective functions so that it scales to as many vehicles as possible.
Okay. Anyone else? So, Ariana, go ahead. This is Dr. Benjamin. If you want to ask it, otherwise I'll just read it. It seems as if COLREGs prescribes a decision tree for mariners, which can be relatively easy. Which can be relatively easily taught to machines, but humans have more ability to analogize to previous, those seemingly unrelated experience and make decisions based on the functioning power and those experiences. Conversely, it seems as if machines would need to be taught, and that's in quotes, those analogous situations in the code. Are machines getting closer to being able to be made to make these analogies on their own? That's her question.
That's a loaded question. Good question. So we're not looking at situations where the vehicles will learn by experience or by analogy. However, our architecture is built in such a way that the handling of situations, generally speaking, but in particular, we would say a collision avoidance with a single vehicle is a situation. Our architecture allows for multiple situations to be handled simultaneously, in other words, multiple vehicles, but also other situations that may occur, such as primary mission objectives or other things that are going on in the environment. So we're big believers of having an architecture that allows the vehicle to be able to handle generic situations. But then one of the reasons why we have open source code is that we have the ability and hooks for people to add their own capabilities to handle these kinds of extensions that you're alluded to here, whether they be product of machine learning or any approach. It's an open-ended hook, and that we make plugging into the system straightforward and easy through the mathematical tools, which have very few assumptions on the methods that input into the system. I hope that answered it.
Well, that was quite a question, Ariana. And Ariana Baker also, I don't know if you know, and Mike, maybe you want to volunteer this, but there are ships running the coasts of Norway and other places that have quite complex collision avoidance systems built into their bridges now, right? So they're fully capable of interacting with other vessels and hopefully not having close calls.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the details of those systems, but I'm aware that they do exist. And of course, it's worth mentioning too, I think that there is a strong overlap in these technologies between things that can enable a robot to do these things and also enable a tool, which is on the bridge, which can recommend maneuver decisions or alert the user that a complex collision avoidance situation is about to occur. So the same algorithms for recommending or producing automated decisions for robots can be used to recommend decisions for humans. And 99.9% of the time, the human doesn't need the recommendation. Everything's just fine. But there are times when you bump into an exceedingly complex situation where you might want to have access to a maneuver recommendation.
That's great. Okay, so Ariana says thank you, and you can see that the IMO, just as late as last month, calls this a humanitarian crisis at sea. What's going on with the crew changes being delayed, and if you can read the question, you can see that they're saying more than 300,000 seafarers and marine personnel are actually stranded at sea. And, maybe we'll start with Captain Jim, and because I think he's seeing some of this out there, I don't know necessarily with Shell and his ships, but with other fleets. And how are we going to handle this sensibly in the future, Jim? You have any ideas?
I think it's a very timely discussion also. I mean, I think one of the things is all players have to be involved, the operators of the vessels, also the countries, the different seaport countries that are around the world that are either we're passing by or going to, and they have to be considerate of the different parties joining. Obviously, they have different protocols and they have different requirements, and trying to find ways to make that work has been an interesting challenge. We've seen steady improvement, and we have a good portion of the vessels that we're involved with have all had crew changes of one another. But the funny thing is some of those crew changes are coming up again now. They've been on board for 6 or 7 months, which are a relatively long period of time. And there's the MLC convention out there that talks about 10 months to a year as a target, so that as the longest. And we've seen people in there for longer now. So we're looking at whenever those come up now, we're interacting with those operators. But I think that the way that there has to be a connection between the different parties, so it's not just a one-sided decision, because the easiest decision is to say, no, we're not going to allow those people to change here or to do this, or a company could say, I'm not going to use a ship that has anybody on board that needs to get off soon. So, it has to be more holistic than the way it's been managed in the past going forward.
That's great. And Mike or John, if you want to chime in any of that, that's fine. Otherwise, let me go back out and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, David, let me address part of that too, because I agree with Captain Jim. We've got several different aspects that have to come in. Now, I've been more than an interested bystander watching this as part of the Ship Operators Co-op program. I have close relationships with MARAD as part of this. ABS has generated its own infectious disease control guide for this, and we've had considerable discussions on this topic. It really comes down to a couple of different things that have to come together in support of the mariners. One is the technical aspect of testing. You have to have reliable and quick testing so that you can actually tell people that they are safe. That contributes to their sense of confidence and their leadership cadre's confidence in what can be done. The second aspect is you have to help the mariners through the leadership on board the ship to stay safe and to be able to do their jobs effectively, and then give them the resources that they need to stay in contact with families and folks at home and so on. And then what you have to have is standardization of policy going across ports and cooperatively between countries, so that you go from one port to the next and you have some expectation that the mariners will be treated the same from one port to the next, so that it gives them confidence and so that they feel like their stress level is. This is mostly about leadership and mostly about standardization, and that's how we see it.
That's great. All right. And just saw something else pop up, but I still do not see any additional questions. I'm going to pull up my last question then. This one is about autonomy. And obviously, we have different levels of autonomy. Some organizations have put up 6 levels of autonomy. This is the IMO's definition with 4 different levels. And I'll give you all a chance to quickly look at them. Obviously, my panelists are very familiar with them. But to give our attendees, and we really appreciate the attendees' questions. They've been very good so far. And we'll take, we still have time for 1 or 2 more after this, but this will be my last. So progress in the maritime industry has proved that, it will come, maybe slower than quicker sometimes, but it will eventually come when the benefits seem obvious. And we're looking at everything from some type of remotely controlled right up to fully autonomous vessels coming in. I don't foresee that happening over the ocean environment, a fully autonomous vessel, for quite some time. But definitely on the coasts of some of the countries, they're looking toward highly autonomous vessels, some totally autonomous. And the question is, what positive impacts of this autonomous evolution will develop for the humans in the industry, and what improvements of resilience will be gained by the maritime sector? Obviously, there's some obvious answers, but some people are concerned about the job situation and what would happen to the lower maritime jobs. But I'd really like to focus on all the good things that might come out of this. So I'll let anybody chime in here. John, this is right up your alley. Mike?
Sure.
I can talk.
Go ahead, John.
I can talk at several different levels, but I think Dr. Benjamin will have the most to say about this. But the idea behind autonomy is not that you're going to go immediately to unmanned vessels. The idea is that your low-pressure air compressor is an automated system that operates as part of your propulsion management system. And what if you put some degree of autonomy automation associated with the air compressors so that you managed your engine and propulsion a little bit differently, so that you can learn a little bit from it? Because the most important part of autonomy or any AI or machine learning scheme, in my estimation, is understanding what the decisions are that have to be made so that you can then decide consciously how to apply technology and how to apply human talent to these problems. So you decompose and you subdivide, and then you build from those building blocks so that you achieve greater capability. And as part of that greater capability, you then have better visibility over safety and reliability and robustness, and then, of course, the resilience of the system, because you're building the systems to work for the human. So with that as my philosophy, I'll turn it over to Dr. Benjamin for his input.
Thanks. So I think that the immediate thing that jumps out from that progression of levels of autonomy is that although that's a perfectly valid progression, it's kind of it's implied that is the only way you can progress is false. There are other ways of looking at progress in autonomy. For example, rather than measuring our level of success based on when we can get rid of the humans and make things fully autonomous, there are already unmanned autonomous marine vehicles, certainly underwater vehicles like gliders, but small autonomous sailboats are already being deployed for doing wide-scale ocean monitoring. And so you could almost look at that there are already autonomous systems out there, fully autonomous systems, and what are those boats going to be able to do in terms of their progression of trust and size and number of sensors and days on station. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this. I do believe that remote control is sort of a four-letter word and it comes to the people who do AI research, but it's being more fully embraced as a way of getting autonomy out into the field sooner, because there's many systems that are capable of being fully autonomous for long periods of time, but only need very periodic intervention. And remote control or remote cameras into those systems is all you really need to be able to trust a system. So I don't think that that list of 4 levels of autonomy, although it is a valid progression, but there are other ways of looking at that progression, and there's other technologies that are going to change the way we look at that progression, and it won't always be the end result is vehicles that don't have humans that are fully autonomous, because we already have platforms that are like that. It's just how are those platforms going to evolve to take on responsibilities that are more like our platforms that are currently being used by humans to do the same job.
Great. Michael Trent, your hand is up again.
And I think I've got my mic on this time.
Okay.
Thanks for your patience. I'm glad we came back to this particular topic because this was the area I had a question in. I've been following automation and autonomous shipping over the last couple of years and looking at a lot of the projects that have been described that are going on in Europe in national waters and the short sea legs and so forth, and some of the benefits that are envisioned both from an economic and an environmental point of view with some of these small cargo vessels that are to be green vessels and distribute cargo from large ports to smaller ports on inland waters. But the question that I had related to the changing role of humans and the automation that we have on the ships. As was said by the panel, we've adapted a lot of automation over the years and a lot of different systems, and we've developed methods for testing those, as John has described today in great detail. And one of the things that I wonder about is how are we focusing today on the self-monitoring of the autonomous systems from a cyber perspective, from a health perspective, and when does the autonomous system know when it's suffering, there is an attempt at hacking, its performance is not what it needs to be, and it's reaching out to the human, because our paradigm is shifting from automation always assisting the human to knowing when we need human intervention for a highly automated system. So I'm wondering, what are we doing in terms of thinking about the self-monitoring nature, really, that John was talking to earlier about a cyber-safe system, knowing that there's vulnerability that's occurring or a system is degrading, and then how, from Mike's perspective, are we looking at the changing role of humans and robotics in terms of autonomy?
That's an excellent question. So we'll let them take it.
So there were a few questions in there. I'm trying to figure out how to unpack and pick one.
It was very layered. Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of human-robot interaction, I think it's worth pointing out that it wasn't that long ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago at most, that your typical mission on a marine vehicle was quite scripted in the sense that it had a sequence of steps, waypoints, if you will, and a schedule and a time to come to the surface or to rendezvous and offload data. And the humans would recover the hard drive or download the data and analyze it, write their papers, and go on. But as more and more capability is on these vehicles and we have the ability to process data and sensor data live, then the vehicles become, they can process their information and make decisions on that information. So they start acting on that. So there's been a shift And although this may seem like it's always been this way, but there's been a shift in the last 10 years or more where the average mission on a platform is more of a sequence of modes that starts in a certain mode, and events and human interaction both contribute to mode changes that the vehicle will undergo as it carries out its mission. And as those modes define and as those missions evolve, the humans have the ability to provide more and more ability for the robots to take initiative if they want to. So, for example, if you have a robot that is searching for a downed black box, it might initially start in a lawnmower pattern that is going back and forth over a large area listening for a pinger. And previously, those vessels might come back and it would report where it heard a pinger. But as we gain more confidence in the robots and its sensing capabilities, we give it the authority to hear a ping and go off and change its patterns such that it spends more time in that area where it had a ping to be able to confirm and maybe even localize where that ping is. Now, that's a huge change in trust in terms of the human-robot interaction while it's in the field, because we're allowing the vehicle to make decisions on its own, and we're getting away from that lawnmower pattern, which has the benefit of being very predictive. We always know where the vehicle is, to allowing the vehicle to go off and follow a hunch or follow its sensors to see whether it can localize something. And that kind of story is playing out, I think, in a lot of marine vehicles and a lot of marine vehicle missions. As we get more confident with the platform and we have the ability to understand what the vehicle is doing, we gain more confidence that the vehicle is healthy and is able to accomplish its mission. We allow it to take initiative. We allow it to be disconnected for longer, and we gain that trust. But it's a very incremental process. But it's worth mentioning that that process is fueled by not only advances in AI and sensing, but it's also fueled by advances in communication. Because the more information we can get from an autonomous vessel back to the shore, we understand what the vehicle is doing, what it's seeing, why it's making its decisions, and the shore operators have greater trust in what the platform is doing and can be eyes off or hands off for longer periods of time. And after a while, you have hands off for quite a long time, or if not, all the time. So that's kind of the progression or goals.
For the part about the reliability of the system and how it might ask humans, there are really two aspects that I'd like to address. The first aspect is that in design of the system, you have to include the aspects to protect the system itself against risk. And so by helping the system to handle risk, or by obviating risk, you can use existing design technologies and design philosophies. For example, design basis threat is a philosophy used in the nuclear power industry, and you can aim specifically to defeat certain things that might be vulnerabilities in the system. And that's one of the philosophies behind the 8 categories of requirements for designing and building a system that I included on the last slide. And that's how we encourage people to design, build, and implement or operate cyber-enabled systems. But the second aspect of it then is the integration of performance management and performance metrics that can indicate toward problematic behavior of cyber-enabled systems. I'm really not so concerned about intrusion or malevolent activity with cyber-enabled systems as I am about human error or software error, or a combination of things that can cause any of the 90% of the problems that we see when we deal with marine clients. Because about 90% of the problems that we see in automation systems are due to software, human error, insufficient knowledge of systems, and so on, or physical breakage. About 10% come down to malevolent activity, insider activity, and things that simply can't be explained. So I'm really concerned for the majority of incidents about what my performance management can indicate. We're working with the Navy right now in 2 programs to try to help them define what some of these parameters are to inform the cyber-enabled systems and inform the cybersecurity systems. And we're trying to combine these intelligently so that the machine does know when to notify the system and raise its hand and say, I need help, please.
I just wanted to sneak this up here only to point out to everybody that, they're talking about full-size ships. And in fact, and Mike Trent, if you're not familiar with it, the Norwegians are going crazy on this. The only thing that slowed them down was COVID here these last few months. But they were about to have the Yara Birkeland, a container vessel, get underway with a small crew, and then next year go crewless and be fully autonomous. She even will be able to moor herself. She'll be able to dock and undock by herself. And it's a fairly good-sized little ship. She holds a few hundred containers, I believe. And it's interesting where some of the Northern European countries are going because they're way ahead of the rest of the world. So as far as fully autonomous, I just wanted to make sure we're talking about, everything from wave gliders and you name it, little tiny robots, all the way up to big ships. But IMO has put this up for ships, and it's going to be interesting where it goes. So I just wanted to reinforce that.
Yeah, no, that was great discussion, and I really appreciate Mike and John's comments on it. And I am very familiar with some of the programs you mentioned, Captain, and of course, the IMO is reporting out on 3 years of looking at what autonomy means in terms of their regulations and instruments at the upcoming Marine Safety Committee next month in November. So it'll be interesting to see what the various nations have contributed to that study and that working group. But thank you for your answers.
Yes, that's great. Well, I think our time is running out, and I don't see any more hands. I don't see any more chat questions. And I'll take one last look, and no, I don't see them. So I really want to thank our experts once again for the superb presentations and answers they just provided. Just many thanks to everybody for hanging in with us, and all those with the insightful questions that were really great to have. So thank you very much, everyone.